And thank you for inviting me to chair this session. It's a very important uh, uh, evidence gap map and review for us at the Asian Development Bank. So I'm the Director General for Independent Evaluation at the ADB. Ari Perdana, my colleague, is the task team leader for this important work. As you know, decision makers have a timeline during which to ensure that they're doing those decisions in as informed a way as possible with proper evidence. Now, even without that evidence, they'll have to make those decisions. So it's very important for us to ensure that the evidence that is presented to them is synthetic, easy to absorb, and in a way that is policy relevant, so that they can make those decisions. So that's why we in the ADB have commissioned the Campbell collaboration to do this systematic review and evidence gap map. And with that, let me turn it over to my colleague Ari, who will give you a little bit of introduction on our project, and then I'll turn it over to our partners at Campbell Collaboration, Ali, Nina, and Howard. So Ari, over to you.
Thank you very much, Manny. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm Ari Perdana, Evaluation Specialist at the Independent Evaluation Department of ADB. So ID is conducting a finance sector evaluation. And to complement the study, we are doing these two studies, study of two parts, the evidence gap map and systematic review. For the evidence gap map, we decided to focus on the access to finance for MSME. The reason is a significant amount of ADB portfolio on finance is about financial inclusion. And after we done with the evidence gap map, we found that there is an area of financial literacy and education, which is on the one hand, the area is not too exploited, meaning that there has been not so overwhelming number of studies compared to the other area of finance sector like microfinance. At the same time, it generates a good number of papers to study and to come up with a systematic review and the meta-analysis. So that's the reason and the sequence of why we came up with the two topics, the two subtopics of for the evidence gap map and systematic review. So why we, ID, conduct this study, evidence gap map and systematic review? We, ID typically, our focus, ID is presenting what works and what doesn't work and why as part of the evaluation work. And our focus is typically, of course, on ADB operations and policy. But of course, we also want to know, we want to extend our knowledge about what works and what doesn't work and why beyond ADB operations. And evidence gap map and systematic review offers us to understand more about the state of literature on the particular topic and the state of evidence beyond ADB operations. Because in the end, we want to know when ADB provides support on particular sector or topic, of course, we want to know whether we do the right thing and whether we do the things right. And that's how the evidence gap map provides us some information on where do our interventions fit with the existing evidence. Are we contributing in filling the knowledge gap, or are we providing support based on the existing knowledge? And also the systematic review inform us on the evidence of what people have done before to to guide us and to provide us some information on whether our support is consistent with the evidence base. Lastly, on our partner Campbell collaborations, so we've developed a very nice partnership for this study. Of course, Campbell collaboration is one institution which is the authority on these methods. We learn so much from our colleagues. At the same time, we also provide some, hopefully we also contributes to the knowledge by providing our experience on evaluation, in particular on ADB operations. So hope you enjoy this webinar, and we learn from Campbell collaboration, but also we would like to learn from you through your comments or inputs through during the webinar. Over to you, Manny.
Thanks very much, Ari. So without further ado, let me turn it over to our presenters. The first one will be Ali Villanueva. I'm very pleased, by the way, that two of my compatriots, Ali and Nina, will have done the work and are presenting to us today on both the evidence gap map and the systematic review. So over to you, Ali.
Thank you, Sir Manny. Now I'll start sharing my screen. So hi everyone, good afternoon. I'm Alyssa Villanueva. I'll be presenting the MSME Finance Evidence and Gap Map report. So my co-authors are Howard White, who are also here, Nina Dela Cruz, who will present the systematic review on financial literacy, Lovito Lin, she's also here, and then Sabrina Dis and Robert Lansing. So what's an evidence and gap map? So an EGM is a systematic presentation of the availability of relevant evidence for a particular policy domain. So identification of evidence is by a search following a pre-specified published search protocol. So basically an EGM summarizes what evidence there is, not what the evidence is. So on your right is an example of an EGM. So we also produce this for the MSE Finance Gap, which will be explained later on. So as you saw earlier, there are cells. So if you click on the cell, you will get the list of records and summaries, and also the URL. So you can access the study using the map. So EGMs increase the discoverability, navigability, and accessibility of studies. So we have 5 steps in constructing an evidence and gap map. First is define the scope or the peak or PICOS, population intervention, comparison, outcome, and study design, which will be explained later on. Then we design and implement the search strategy. So we will also discuss some databases later where we gather the studies. Then we screen identified studies. So we were 4 screeners, 2 pairs. Then one person from the other pair is the arbitrator. Then after screening, based on our inclusion criteria, we code the studies based on our framework also that we developed, and then we generate the map and prepare the report. So the objectives of this EGM is to establish a clear definition of the interventions and outcomes related to improving access to finance of MSMEs. Second is to map the studies of the impact of the interventions on MSMEs' access to financing projects or programs based on primary studies and systematic reviews. And lastly, to provide a descriptive overview of interventions, context, study designs, and the geographical distribution of studies. So here we have the list of databases where we gathered studies, and then we also did hand search or gray literature, wherein we explored the different institutional websites as well as journals. So now, because of the search strategy, using search terms, and also because of the gray literature, we identified for the search strategy, we identified 12,344 studies and excluded the duplicates. And then we also screened based on the title and abstract, and then excluded some studies. since they did not meet the inclusion criteria. And then we were down to 967 studies for the full text screening, wherein we excluded some of the studies because they did not meet our criteria on country, population, intervention, etc. And also some are duplicates and full texts were not available. So for coding, we were able to include 454 studies, and then we excluded some more studies based on duplicates and study design, and then some full texts were also not available. So for the included studies, we have 317. So that's for the first phase. For the second phase, we did the hand search. So we started from full text screening, and then we also did the supplemental search for the systematic review on financial literacy, which allowed us to have 196 plus 16 more studies. Then we also excluded based on study design some studies. And then for coding and eligible reviews from Duvendak, 2019, and also studies for systematic review on financial literacy, we were able to add 74 studies plus 22 plus 7. And then we excluded. So final count is 96 studies for the second phase. So adding up studies from the first and second, we have 413 studies in the map. So now we discuss PICOS. So population, we included micro, small, and medium enterprises, wherein micro enterprises are single person, household, and agricultural households. And we also included financial institutions, agencies, and their staff. And then we have subgroups for women, young people, older people, poor and disadvantaged, humanitarian settings, people with disabilities, those who live in rural areas, urban areas, and both rural and urban. And then we also have the sectors, agriculture, construction, manufacturing, transportation and communication, wholesale and retail trade, and services, and others. Then countries included are low income countries and then middle income countries, both lower middle and upper middle. Then we have 5 categories for intervention: strategy, legislation and regulation, systems and institutions, facilitating access, lending instruments and financial products, and demand-side interventions, wherein we have the different subcategories. Then the same goes for outcomes. We have main categories: policy and regulatory environment, financial inclusion, enterprise or firm performance, and welfare outcomes. And then they also have their corresponding subcategories. So for the study design, we included experimental studies such as RCTs and natural experiments. Then we also included non-experimental study designs or quasi-experimental study designs such as RDD, PSM, DID, IVs, and other matching designs with awareness of selection bias, as well as systematic reviews. And we exclude studies that have before versus after designs with no comparison group. And we also excluded qualitative evidence or study designs. So here is the MSE Finance EGM. So as you can see, we have the interventions for the rows and then the outcomes for the columns. So here, the bubbles, if they're green, it means that they're experimental studies. If they're blue, non-experimental. And if they're orange, they are systematic reviews. And then the larger the size of the bubble is, it means that there are more studies in that cell. So now this is another version of the map wherein we just added the numbers of the studies as text. So as you can see here, there are a lot of lending instruments or financial products based on the 4th row, as you can see. And then there's a few evidence on policy and regulatory environment based on the 1st column. Then there's also more evidence on enterprise performance and welfare outcomes, as you can see, based on the 3rd and 4th columns, the large bubbles. So now we have we discussed the overview of included studies by study design and country by region. So as you can see here, we have more studies in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, wherein majority of the studies are experimental studies. And then only few studies in Middle East and North Africa, as well as Europe, Central Asia, and Latin and Caribbean. So the number of studies as per the study design and intervention. So as you can see, as mentioned earlier, we have more on lending instruments and financial products. Then also non-experimental studies dominate. Then we have the geographical map of number of studies by country. So as you can see on the upper right, we have color-coded the number of studies depending on how many studies there are. So as you can see here, majority are in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And then you can see the green area, India. So it has majority of the studies. So more than 50 studies. Then we also have the most common authors in the EGM. So we identified the number 45 studies and then check which author, the names of the authors, and what included here does not mean that they're the first authors. Then we have the distribution of population group by income. So as you can see here, we have more studies set in rural that have population that are in rural areas, as well as women and poor and disadvantaged. And then majority of the outcomes examine welfare, as shown by the green bars. And the number of studies by types of firm receiving the intervention and intervention category. We have here the majority, again, lending instruments or financial products, wherein we have 174 studies. Then we have few studies for the community group, as shown by the second row. And then for the rest, like demand side intervention, micro enterprises have the majority. The number of studies by types of firm receiving the intervention and outcome category. Micro enterprises also have the majority, and then welfare outcomes, it's 271 studies, followed by enterprise performance. Then you can also note for the small enterprise and medium enterprise, the majority of the outcomes are enterprise performance, 59 studies, and then for medium, 34 studies. And then also a few studies under policy and regulatory environment for across all firm types. Then now we discussed interventions per category. So we have the strategy, legislation, and regulation by outcomes. So here, the dominant subcategory is the financial sector, legislation, and regulations with 39 studies for microenterprises and SMEs. Then for the systems and institutions by outcomes, we have the microfinance institutions and savings clubs for the majority of the studies for microenterprises. And then we can also note that for formal financial system, we have equal number of studies for MSMEs. The next is facilitating access by outcomes. The majority is or use fintech or digital financial services with 29 studies. And then the fourth category, which is the lending instruments, which is the most common type of intervention. We have over 200 studies for microcredit, 201 for microenterprises, and 37 for SMEs. So here the difference is that for microcredit, most of them examines the outcome on welfare, while for SMEs, they mostly examine outcome for firm performance. Then lastly, we have the demand side interventions by outcomes. So majority of the studies fall under financial literacy and education program subcategory, wherein majority of the studies study microenterprises. We're targeted towards microenterprises. We have 64 studies. And then for SMEs, we have 15 studies. So this will be the topic of the systematic review, and we'll know more about it later. And then doing the EGM, we have identified major gaps. So two areas of major gaps are strategy, legislation, and regulation as intervention. So there are only a few studies, as well as few studies on policy and regulatory environment as outcomes. And then there's also relatively few evidence on demand-side interventions targeted to SME. So as shown earlier in the previous slide, more on microenterprises. Then we should have potential study settings in Middle East, North Africa, Europe, and Central Asia, and Latin America and Caribbean. As what mentioned earlier, most studies are in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Then there's also major gap on studies about PWDs, youth, urban population, and humanitarian, as mostly studies were on women, poor and rural areas. Then there's few systematic review evidence on interventions facilitating access, while few experimental evidence on systems and institutions as interventions. Then here we discuss the implications for research. So first is to explore strategy, legislation, and regulation interventions and include qualitative studies which might capture such interventions and effectively appraise its quality. The next is a potential research focus on interventions targeting SMEs and looking at policy and regulatory environment outcomes and welfare outcomes. Then it's also worth noting that an emerging area is about interventions facilitating access using technology, fintech, digital services. And then further research should be conducted in other regions to allow more holistic understanding of the effects of financial inclusion interventions. And then an annual update of the map should be done continuously as evidence piles up on various financial sector interventions and even innovative programs that improve MSMEs access to finance. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Ali. Very, very interesting and very clear presentation. Before we turn it over to our floor for discussion, I would encourage our participants to collect their thoughts and their questions. You might start putting them in the chat if you think of that. But in the meantime, I'd like to turn it over to Nina to present us the results of the systematic review. Over to you, Nina.
Thank you, Sir Manny. So let me share my screen. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. So on behalf of our team, I'm Nina Dela Cruz, and I will be presenting the preliminary results of the systematic review and meta-analysis on the impacts of financial literacy interventions for micro, small, and medium enterprises, or MSMEs. So first off, let me briefly define what a systematic review is. So a systematic review must have the following: clear inclusion and exclusion criteria, an explicit search strategy, systematic coding and analysis of included studies, and meta-analysis where possible. So on the right side, you can see a sample study of one of the relevant review of reviews we have screened to acquire some studies for the map and eventually for this review. So the difference of a review from this review is ours is focusing on the interventions. So we have learned earlier about the scope of the EGM on different interventions improving access to finance for MSMEs. So the focus of this review is on the impacts of financial literacy, which is theorized to promote participation, access to finance markets, and the ability to make sound financial decisions, and is considered a prerequisite for MSMEs to operate efficiently and achieve sustainability. So despite of this importance for MSMEs, financial literacy of entrepreneurs around the world remains generally low. So in recognizing such need for financial literacy, particularly for entrepreneurs or MSMEs, such interventions support individuals and businesses with the capability, knowledge, skills, attitudes, and behaviors needed to perform in their own best interests and to choose and utilize financial products and services according to their needs. So these interventions considered for the review are the following, which are divided into 4 main domains, such as the financial education interventions, informational and behavioral nudges, financial counseling, and multi-component interventions. So the first 3 are the single interventions or provided single-handedly, and the multi-component interventions are the bundled ones. So the next column provides the different examples or specific interventions under per domain. So we have financial literacy training, business and financial literacy program, financial literacy course under financial education. And for the informational and behavioral nudges, we have financial education messages, interactive applications. We also include here awareness of financial products. And for financial counseling, one example would be financial goal setting and also financial planning. And for the multi-component, we have interventions with bundled with savings or self-help groups and credits, grants, and insurance. So we are excluding financial literacy interventions for personal finance for this review. So how do these financial literacy interventions might work? So you would notice that this figure is a bit too crowded. So let me just give a quick walkthrough. So as you can see from the top, those are the financial literacy interventions in blue circles, and the blue boxes are the specific activities, and these lead to various intermediate outcomes represented by the light green boxes, so such as the increasing in financial knowledge, changing risk perceptions, utilizing financial products and services, and improving business practices. So these intermediate outcomes will eventually lead to higher level of outcomes, such as welfare, including economic and gender, and firm performance indicators. So moving toward the inclusion and exclusion criteria, here's an overview of the PICOs minus the intervention, as we have already discussed earlier. So for the population, we are including owners of the MSMEs, individuals involved in business activities, or who are looking to start businesses, smallholder farmers, and single-person enterprises. And we excluded owners of large firms or individuals who did not report any business activity. And for the comparisons, the criteria is a comparison could be made with another financial literacy intervention, another type of intervention like financial inclusion or financial access, or no intervention at all. And studies with no control group or unmatched controls are excluded in this review. And for the outcomes, we are including financial literacy and knowledge, financial behavior, business engagement, firm performance indicators, and welfare outcomes, such as economic and gender outcomes. And for the study designs, we are including RCTs, quasi-experimental study design, such as regression discontinuity, PSM, DID, and IV, and we exclude qualitative studies and systematic reviews. So for the objectives of the review is to provide evidence on the impacts of financial literacy and interventions, including multi-component ones for MSMEs in low and middle income countries. So this review will also inform on the heterogeneity among interventions, leading to different outcomes or measure other outcomes aside from financial literacy. So the following are the specific research questions to be answered. So what are the effects of financial literacy and education programs on firm performance and welfare outcomes? And what are the effects of multi-component interventions bundled with financial literacy on the same outcomes? And what factors or characteristics are associated with better outcomes? And if context-specific, what are the context or mechanisms that facilitate the effectiveness of such interventions? So you've seen earlier during the EGM presentation the comprehensive flow of the search strategy and how we have screened and coded the studies. So the studies we have included in the review came from the map, and including the supplemental research from different journals, answer journals, and organizational websites. So we have found 69 studies on financial literacy and education program interventions. And from these, we have excluded 17, and we have included 52 studies for the meta-analysis. So for the included studies, majority of them are randomized controlled trials or RCTs from other regions, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And across the ADB regional grouping, majority of the studies are from the South Asia and are from South Asia and Pacific and are also RCTs. So for the data extraction and management, aside from the systematic coding of the eligible studies, we have also coded in for the so-called moderators or different intervention characteristics per study. This will eventually be used in further analysis, particularly in performing a meta-regression. So to give an idea of what kind of studies are included in the review, here's a sample paper. Here's a paper by Dela et al. 2014 about business training and female enterprise startup growth and dynamics, which is an RCT study, and the intervention or treatment provided is business and financial literacy program bundled with grants, and the outcomes measured are financial behavior and firm performance. So for the assessment of risk of bias, we have used the IDCG, the International Development Campbell Coordinating Group Risk of Bias tool. And the overall confidence in the study is low because of high distributions among the spillovers, other biases, and selective outcome reporting, as you can see from this series of graphs. For the intervention type by outcomes, this table shows the results of the outcomes considering studies with passive control groups. So most of the studies are financial education interventions measuring financial behavior, firm performance, and economic outcomes. So this also tells us that financial literacy interventions do not necessarily measure financial literacy outcomes. So, and more studies are also providing multi-component interventions across all outcomes. So to provide some initial results from the meta-analysis, we are presenting here the outcome under financial behavior with specific outcome measures like attendance or take-up, saving or borrowing behavior, or the likelihood of saving or likelihood of borrowing, loan repayment, membership in savings groups, financial planning, and savings goals are just some of the examples. So for the left graph, you can see the subgroup analysis between multi-component versus between multi-component intervention and single interventions. And multi-component intervention studies are more statistically significant than single interventions, with as shown by the confidence interval tails. While for the right graph, it shows a subgroup analysis between non-RCT and RCT studies, and non-RCT studies are more statistically significant than the RCT ones. And for the effect sizes, non-RCT and multi-component interventions have higher effects than the single and the RCT studies. But overall, we have small effect. We have small effect but significant represented by the 0.11 and moderate heterogeneity for the overall of these studies with 59% as the I-squared. So here we have the summary table of the effect sizes by outcome indicators, as this review or meta-analysis is still in work in progress. So this table just shows that there is obvious heterogeneity in outcomes, and bigger effects are on multi-component intervention studies compared to single intervention studies, while non-RCT studies have also bigger effects versus RCT studies. And generally, overall, there are small effects but significant across all outcomes. So for this one, this shows the funnel plots exit test as a test for publication bias. So we are just showing here for the results for the two outcomes, financial literacy knowledge and financial behavior. So many effect sizes lie outside the confidence region, suggesting that there's high heterogeneity of the studies, which we also have seen in the forest plots earlier. So Edgar's test presents that there are publication bias because no symmetries for both outcomes. However, for the financial behavior, the p-value is significant at 10%, while the rest of outcomes are insignificant, um, like the ones on financial literacy and knowledge. So to wrap up this presentation, here are some key takeaways. So most of the studies assessing financial literacy interventions do not measure financial literacy as outcome. The overall effect sizes are small but significant following the 0.2 or less threshold and favoring the treatment or intervention groups, as most of the studies, in the forest plots, you can see that most of the studies lie at the right side of the line of no effect. And the effects of multi-component intervention studies are more statistically significant among outcome indicators, except for economic outcomes. And more research is needed to pull more eligible studies in the review, especially ones measuring financial literacy, as we have shown some evidences of obvious heterogeneity among the studies. So thank you very much for listening, and we hope to gain some feedback and comments as we're still working on the analysis for this review. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Nina. Again, I encourage the participants to please start thinking about your questions and start sharing them in the chat. Let me now turn it over to Howard, who will, I think, round out the two presentations. So Howard, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Manny, and thank you, Ali and Nina, for such nice, clear presentations. I wanted to draw out just a few main points from both presentations that I think highlight the value of what we've learned from these exercises. So first, which I think we need to emphasize, was when we agreed to do this map and review, it's going to be a map review of interventions to improve financial inclusion for micro, small and medium enterprises. And so there's quite a large literature on the effects of financial inclusion, which are basically associational studies of people who have borrowed money from microfinance, have their effects on business or assets or welfare and so on, but they're associational studies. There's no intervention there. And that means they probably also have some bias in them, as social studies often do, or cannot talk about a clear directional effect. So we're not interested in microfinance for consumption purposes. We're interested in microfinance, financial inclusion for productive purposes. And so it's first focused on micro, small and medium enterprises. We had some discussion at the start, one of our early on the work, one was the first discussions we had was, is it interventions only or is it financial inclusion per se? So the difference between our work and the review of reviews by Maren Duvendak that Nina showed to start a presentation on financial inclusion is Maren's review is a review of reviews of financial inclusion, whereas ours is a map and review of financial inclusion interventions. And so they have to be intervention studies. And that was one of the first discussions we had, and we agreed that. Our next discussion was basically, are we including agricultural households? And the answer was yes. And that meant also we're including household enterprises, single person enterprises, micro enterprises. And that changed quite a lot. And so Ali mentioned this in passing. That changed quite a lot what we're looking at. Ali mentioned this in passing. So most of the stuff that goes to micro enterprises is basically savings clubs and microcredit. There's some other stuff, including financial literacy, but a lot of it is microcredit. So that opened up the available literature that's eligible for the map a lot by deciding to include household enterprises, household financial inclusion interventions. And something Ali mentioned in passing is the literature on micro enterprises for women's groups and single person enterprises focuses quite a lot on welfare outcomes. And it doesn't say much about firm performance. That doesn't come across so clearly in our slide because we included employment. These studies might talk about employment, and employment's a firm performance variable. And so it does show they measure firm performance, but really it's looking at employment, the actual profitability, sales, the workings of these micro enterprises, pretty much neglected. Focus on final welfare outcomes. What happens to the health of the children, nutrition of the children in households that receive microcredit, lots of stuff. What actually happens in these businesses, the returns to investment? Not much. It's really underexplored. And I did work on this area myself. I'm over 10 years ago in Andhra Pradesh, and I did what I called ethnographic bookkeeping, of basically talking to individual women in self-help groups about their cash flows. And they didn't have a very clear idea of them, particularly. When you did, what you could work out was the income they were getting was like 30 to 50 rupees a day. So it's not, it was nice to bit of money to have on the side, but it's not life-changing. It's not lifting not the household out of poverty. Now, maybe those case studies were exceptional and other enterprises have more returns, but this lack of looking at the returns, the financial performance at the micro enterprise level is quite striking. On the other hand, when you look at the small and medium enterprise studies, they look at firm performance. They don't look at welfare outcomes. And so, I mean, not entirely, you see some do, but by and large, they're interested in firm performance outcomes, but not in actual final welfare outcomes of owners or employees. So that seems there's there's gaps there. There's gap, and that's what MAP's meant to show, is gaps. So in terms of SME enterprise, SME support, there's a gap in terms of looking at what final welfare outcomes, but in terms of looking at micro enterprise, there's a gap looking at the performance of the firms. Moving over to the financial literacy review, Nina mentioned these points in her slides. Less than half of the studies of financial literacy interventions look at financial literacy as an outcome. This is really common, but a real problem in impact evaluation designs is people don't look at intermediate variables along the causal chain. So we're looking at financial literacy interventions for owners or potential owners of micro and small and medium enterprises. And so we are interested in firm behavior, firm performance, and final welfare outcomes, but the interventions are to improve financial literacy. That's the first step in the causal chain. So measure it, okay? Because what we'd like to see is, okay, financial literacy improves, business engagement improves, business performance improves, and therefore you get improvements in welfare. And if you're not looking at that first step in the causal chain, when you don't see an improvement in the intended outcomes, then you can't explain it because you don't know whether it's because the financial literacy didn't improve or it did, but that wasn't sufficient by itself to improve the other outcomes. Or you can see, okay, when it improves by this much, then this goes on and so on, or which designs even are better at improving financial literacy. That's where the thing starts. So let's look at that first of all. So we need more studies. We always say more research needed. There's some reviews that conclude no more research needed. We just know this thing works or doesn't work. Stop researching that. But in this case, more research is needed. Research that overcomes the problems that Nina highlighted in the risk of bias assessment, but also this failure to measure financial literacy outcomes themselves. We've just finished this meta-analysis last week, and it does show fairly clear pattern of, as Nina said, it's small effects but significant effects. So actually, I'd just like to question also that, or at least raise awareness of that. There's small effects because they're around 0.1, 0.15 at best, at using Cohen's thresholds of 0.2 for small, 0.6 for 0.2 to 0.6 for moderate. But people question whether Cohen's thresholds, which come from psychology studies, are appropriate in other areas. Studies in the last couple of years in education suggesting, there's one particular by Kraft, suggesting 0.05 to 0.2 as being moderate for education outcome interventions and less than 0.05 as being small. So and that would therefore put these results, if those thresholds are applied, actually in the moderate range rather than the small range. So we actually don't know in this area what we'd expect effect size to look like. And so there's a big research agenda needed for people who do reviews to say, okay, let's build up libraries of effect sizes to figure out what is a large or small effect size in this particular area. Another point to mention, so just a couple more, is we've got these results. We do see this. Oh, well, two things. One is we see multi-sector multi components generally performing single component, but that's in bivariate analysis, not multivariate, so we have to see if that stands up. But also, it's not that clear a pattern. So it's generally true across most topic areas that multi-sector does work better than single sector. So as multi-component does work better than single component. May or may not be true here. We need to check it. But what we do see is that the non-RCTs have larger effects than the RCTs, and that's pretty standard. And that's probably because there's residual selection bias in the non-experimental designs. And there are a lot of RCTs in this area. So really in this review, I would say forget about the non-RCTs. Some reviews just basically trim effect sizes at -1 and 1, because anything outside that's deemed to probably be unreliable. I think all the non-RCTs have effect sizes greater than 1, so they'd get trimmed if we applied that rule. So there's probably selection bias going on. And I asked Nin to compare a table of the non-RCTs, so I go, whoa, look at that, that's obviously bias. And actually they're not, they look pretty good. They're PSM, RDD, so they look on the face of it. People like me who believe in non-experimental methods will say, no, that sounds okay, you're doing best you can. And best you can isn't good enough. Because in areas, when I talk about selection bias, entrepreneurship is one area I always use an example, where there's basically this oomph. People who want to be entrepreneurs, successful entrepreneurs, have this oomph. And so the people who have the oomph and want to succeed are more likely to take part in financial literacy, do well in financial literacy, and your PSM hasn't got a measure of oomph. And so when you're controlling on observables, you're not controlling on oomph. And so this means you're going to get biased results in your PSM. And that's what we're seeing, basically. So this review is one where I would say, oh, look, we see that some areas in which you do the best you can control on observables, but they're actually unobservables. You could try and measure oomph. But if you're not trying to measure it, then you've got something not observed that's causing residual selection bias to come into your estimates. And I think that's pretty clearly happening here. Point. Oh, so we're still work in progress. So we have done some work and it came out quite nicely. Here's a set of studies, around a quarter of them, where it just works across the causal chain, as large effects across the causal chain. Here's a set of studies with weak effects of the causal chain. Here's a set of studies with no effect at any point in the causal chain. And then there's some where effects get weak across the causal chain, what I call function of attrition. And there's a few, but very few studies where the ordering of the outcomes doesn't sort of make sense, like it's lower down the causal chain, higher up the causal chain. Generally not. So we're going to try and use that typology to explore what works and what doesn't work, but we haven't got many included studies. I mean, it started with 64. For any one outcome, it's much less, it's far fewer. And so we're going to try and dig deeper. So watch this space when the review gets published. We would like to try and learn more about what works and what doesn't. So at the moment, I would say financial literacy interventions look promising. Don't abandon them. This review says, yes, it's something to try, but we need to learn a lot more. We'll learn what we can from this review, but basically we need to, ADB and other funders need to go out and do another 30, 40, 50 RCTs, well-designed RCTs of these programs, and come back in 3 years and do this review again. We've got much richer data set to what works. So thank you. Back to you, Manny.
Thanks a lot, Howard, Nina, and Ali. We have exactly 9 minutes left for questions to our presenters. Please raise your hand and I'll recognize you. I think I can see everybody. I have one, Howard, while our friends are waiting. One is on this issue that you raised about non-RCT and RCT results being different. Is it also possible that the kinds of interventions that RCT studies looked at were different than non-RCT studies, those that are more conducive to randomization as opposed to other designs? Or is it really what you said, the residual?
Of course, that's possible in principle, Manny, because we have got, that's a bivariate analysis. So when we've done the we're doing the when we're doing the meta regression, and if we use RCT and non-RCT in the meta regression, so we're controlling for what sector of intervention, type of intervention is, and so on, that will give a better result. Unfortunately, degrees of freedom are really quite limited for doing a comprehensive meta regression. So we've got study design variables like RCT and non-RCT. Then we've got intervention design variables like what the intervention is in terms of the topology of interventions we have, and we'd like to put them all in the meta regression together. It's just across different outcome categories, and we don't really have the degrees of freedom to do that. So we're seeing what we can do along those lines, but just on a crude level, the answer is no, actually, both because these financial literacy interventions are just amenable to randomization. They're done at individual household level, so you can easily randomize them. It's not a community level place-based intervention or something where you get complicated needing a cluster design and so on. And secondly, no, actually, if you look at, they are across the same intervention categories. They're distributed across the same intervention categories as the RCTs. So I don't think that is the explanation. I do think it's residual selection bias, but when we get the meta regression as best specified as we can, we'll have a better answer.
No, thanks. But just to be clear, that this is you said, I think you said that this is a result that holds true in other sectors or other types of studies, regardless of
pretty much. So one thing we often do is do a plot where we show low, medium, and high confidence study findings, which are driven in large part by dealing with selection bias, and you just see this drift, assuming the desirable effect is positive, you just see this drift to the left as you go down the forest plot. So low confidence studies, whopping great big effect, and then medium confidence studies, yeah, it's still quite nice, and then RCTs, yeah, nothing much going on. So it's quite common to see that, yes.
Okay, great.
If you look at the review on impact of microcredit on women's empowerment, it's a very nice example of that. So large effect on the low confidence studies, no effect at all from the RCTs.
Okay, thanks. We have a few more minutes, so I encourage participants. I hope you had time to think about really pointed questions. It was a very clear presentation, but I'm sure people have interesting things. So can I call on someone to comment? Otherwise, Ari, from what you've heard, to what extent would we be able to use this analysis, including the evidence gap map, for our work?
Yes, so there's a couple of interesting things, well, many interesting things from both the EGM and systematic review. And one finding is that from the systematic review, I'll start with the systematic review because financial literacy is, well, ADB has done quite a lot financial literacy intervention in our operations. Although sometimes it's spread, it's categorized not always under finance projects, but maybe under PSM or under other sectors. But the results suggest that financial literacy does make difference. Although, of course, I hate to use this term, this phrase again and again. It's not a magic bullet. Of course, nothing is a magic bullet. But yes, financial literacy is one important component of financial intervention that it shows that it works. We've seen that it works, and our study shows that it works. It does make a significant change, not big, so it still have a potential to continue. So that's one takeaway that we can use from this study.
Thanks. I had a question for Nina on the financial literacy. Were you also gathering information about the costs of the various interventions and whether it'll be possible to compare the cost effectiveness across types of intervention?
We have gathered as moderators the training cost, but it's just like a dummy variable if it's free training or if it's not free, or like you have to pay something for that financial literacy training. So, but since there's a small number of studies as well, so some studies do not report about that training cost or intervention cost for per study. So so I think it will be like I mean, few observations will be captured by that.
And that's of
But we
course the
have
cost to participants. We would like, of course, I don't think we put the question in there in the end. We would like, of course, to report on the cost to the provider. It's just so rarely reported in effective studies. I think actually none of his studies reported it, and so we normally have it as one of the review questions, but we then can't answer it because there's no data available. Of course, we'd like to look at cost effectiveness rather than effectiveness. And it's just not done. As you know, Manny, from 3IE, we required grantees to report cost data, and most of them wouldn't, and just said it's not available. When it was their job to try and collect it, but even then they're doing the primary studies, they wouldn't do it. So the primary studies don't report it. And their point is, and it's a sad reflection on the fact of social science publishing, that they would say, and several grantees said to me directly, I was at 3IE, the journals aren't interested in this. We can't publish that information. They just want to see the statistical significance, and that's just, it's true. But as journal publishers and as editors of JDIF, we should take this in mind, are wrong. They should be insisting on what's actually relevant to decision makers, which is cost effectiveness, not statistical significance.
That's great. Okay, thanks. Well, I see now we are at 6:59 Manila time, so we need to wrap up. Again, let me thank Nina, Ali, especially for very clear presentations, Ari for orchestrating, causing this to be done, and Howard for your insights at the end. It's been really great, and we look forward to the final reports and the completion of the SR.